The start of humanity, of history, of Stone Age, begins with the Paleolithic. This was the longest period in our history, and saw slow but steady development of human biology, as well as tools and artistic forms. This was the time of the last ice age of Pleistocene, which contained multiple colder, glacial periods which were separated by warmer, interglacial periods. The Paleolithic begins with the earliest examples of discovered stone tools, so-called choppers, which date as far back as 2.5 million years ago, from the heartland of human origin, Africa. The first examples of human presence in Europe were found in Spain, at the site of Gran Dolina, and are approximately 1 million years old. In the early, Lower Paleolithic, Europe was inhabited by Homo heidelbergensis, also called archaic Homo sapiens. It is from this Europe-dwelling branch that the Neanderthals developed from. Meanwhile, the anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, developed from the population of Homo heidelbergensis that remained in Africa. This theory has recently been disputed though, suggesting that the last common ancestor of Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans was much older. It is worth noting that human development was not linear, from one species to the next, but multiple different species could exist at the same time, even mingle with one another. It is a common idea that people of Stone Age lived only in caves, giving the term cavemen. This, however, is not true. People sought shelter not only in caves, but also in simple makeshift huts of bone, tusks, wood, and hides. While stone was indeed one of the main materials used in the Stone Age, wood and other organic materials were also used, but any surviving find is exceptional and hard to discover. It is difficult to accurately imagine life in these earliest times. Beside archaeological finds, historians seek parallels with present-day natural societies that remained mostly isolated from technological progress and other interference. The people of Paleolithic and later Mesolithic lived in nomadic hunter-gatherer communities, hordes. These contained 5 to 60 members of an extended family. Multiple related hordes could join to form a clan. All members participated in procuring food or helped with other work. Some hordes have a leader, who gains the status through strong character and martial abilities. These earliest peoples had a close, respectful relationship with nature. They moved according to the seasons, migrations of animals, plant growth, and natural disasters. From the Lower Paleolithic onwards, humans also utilized fire, with which they repulsed predators, prepared food, and used for light and warmth. Fire was the centerpiece of early human societies, enabling survival, but also storytelling and other cultural and social aspects. Women of Paleolithic and Mesolithic had on average 5 to 6 children, but not many lived through puberty due to malnourishment and illness. Those that did could live up to 40 or 50 years, in some cases even longer. Even the earliest peoples seem to have had a sense of symmetry and aesthetics. Along those came the sense of spirituality, religion, and art. The discovered symbolic products and art pieces of Lower and Middle Paleolithic are far more basic and fewer in number than those of later anatomically modern humans, but they do exist. Unusually shaped and colored rocks, not suitable for tool production, were picked up and carried with a horde from one place to the next, indicating some kind of value or importance to the bearer. Some stones were additionally marked with lines and primitive symbols. Skulls of cave bears were transported in and out of caves, intentionally placed on an isolated flat boulder to form an altar, or face each other, towards east and west. The exact reasoning behind these and many other similar occurrences are impossible to determine with certainty, but they give us a strong inclination that such cultural aspects were present in people even before the arrival of anatomically modern humans. Even then, people probably wanted to explain the world around them. With the Neanderthals began the Middle Paleolithic in Europe, approximately 250,000 years ago. They were physically well adapted for life in the Ice Age with their stocky, muscled frame and short limbs to limit warmth loss. Neanderthals spent most of their life out in the open, where they could hunt and gather food. But it is in the caves, which served Neanderthals as a refuge, where archaeologists have found most artifacts. Neanderthals are associated with the so-called Mousterian technological phase or culture. This was one of many Paleolithic cultures, most of which were named after archaeological sites in France. Neanderthals of the Mousterian culture made stone tools using Levallois flaking technique, again named so after a rich site near Paris. This method was not very economical, as only 1 or 2 points could be obtained from the stone core, which had to be prepared before delivering the final blow that separated the point projectile or flake of desired shape. Hard silicate rocks with conchoidal fractures were most commonly used when creating such tools. Flakes could be retouched for a specific function, like sawing, scraping and polishing. Any damaged tools they would have rather repaired than discard. Neanderthals also used bone tools, but to a much lesser extent than anatomically modern humans later. Bone working was not standardized nor widespread in Mousterian, and it appeared only sporadically. Neanderthals also used wood like yew for their tools. Such wood is very tough and hard, much more suitable for tools and weapons than for burning, for which they preferred pine and spruce. Neanderthals attached levalloy point to a wooden shaft using plant and animal fibers, combined with tree resin. They used such items to hunt animals like marmots, hares, deer, elk, wild boar and bison, and even woolly rhinoceros and cave bear. The diet of Neanderthals vastly differed depending on their environment. By the sea and other bodies of water they consumed fish, some preferred game meat, others plant-based food like pine nuts, moss, tree bark and mushrooms. In some extreme cases, they even resorted to cannibalism. Their knowledge of wildlife, survival and nature enabled him to identify useful plants, like those with medicinal properties and those that numb pain. Moreover, bones of some buried Neanderthals show signs of severe injury, which was then healed. That was only possible if they were tended by fellow Neanderthals, who cared for them enough to save their lives. The word Neanderthal often bears negative connotations of someone primitive and uncultured, but that wasn't so. The levalloy production of stone tools and flaking required good vision of finished product beforehand and a precise execution. This indicates advanced cognitive and motor abilities. Furthermore, Neanderthals were the first inhabitants of Europe to produce clothes, jewelry, music, art, and buried their dead along with grave goods. Red ochre and simple symbols predating anatomically modern humans have been found across Europe. They used this not just for cave paintings, but also to paint their own bodies. If nothing else, Neanderthals definitely had a sense of aesthetics and appreciated art, be it of their own making or of natural origin. And while these examples can't compare to the examples of modern humans, the artistic expressions of Neanderthals are definitely present, even if rare, different, and often difficult to recognize. They saw the world through their own perspective and probably weren't motivated to depict the physical or spiritual worlds around them often. It is music that deserves a special mention, specifically the oldest musical instrument found so far. This is a small bone flute, made from the left thigh bone of a young cave bear, made 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. This means it predates the arrival of anatomically modern humans, therefore leaving Neanderthals as its creators. The flute has been subjected to continuous research since its discovery in 1995, trying to determine its purpose and origin. Originally having 4 holes, 3 on the posterior side and 1 on the anterior side, now only 2 are fully visible. Besides drilling in the holes, the Neanderthals also intentionally sharpened the rim on top to act as a mouthpiece. Its design suits the use of a right-hand user, though both hands are required to play flute effectively. Musical notes have been performed on a reconstructed copy of the flute, as well as imitation of noises produced by wild game and birds, suggesting a Neanderthal could use such a tool for hunting. Neanderthals carved a small hollow into the bone with a pointed stone tool, and then pierced through it with a bone punch, resulting in a hole. Archaeologists used replicas of Neanderthal tools found by the flute to recreate this exact process, with successful results. Meanwhile, the attempts to show how holes could be made by a carnivore animal have proven unsuccessful. All these analyses and experiments show that this artifact is indeed genuine, the oldest known object made with the specific intention of producing music. The successful use of the bone flute has further implications by suggesting that Neanderthals and modern humans had similar, if not identical, vocal tracts, meaning Neanderthals were also capable of speech. Despite this earliest known instrument being found in Europe, the beginnings of music should be looked for years earlier in Africa, even millions of years ago. There the first rhythmic sequences of percussion music were probably created by hitting 2 rocks together. At first, this was probably a byproduct of first stone tools, but sooner or later, the earliest humans probably performed music for their own social and cultural satisfaction. Neanderthals' extinction wasn't sudden, but occurred gradually over 10,000 years. Their extinction during this time coincides with the arrival of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens. Their first contact happened not in Europe, but in the Near East, where there are no differences between the two when it comes to tools and other artifacts they made. There are many theories about Neanderthals' extinction. Were they simply exterminated by the new human species? Were they a victim of an epidemic? Or were they just less successful in finding food, compared to anatomically modern humans, who were able to create hunting traps, used more sophisticated projectile weapons, like bow and arrow, and utilized more economical production of stone tools and blades? The first two options, epidemic and large-scale war, seem least likely, considering that the population of Neanderthals would diminish much sooner than it had. There is also this: Neanderthals and modern humans had friendly relations, and likely boosted the cultural prosperity of each other. They even exchanged meals, kiss, and interbreed. The genomes of the two species show 99.84% overlap, and present-day white Europeans' DNA contains about 2 to 5% of that of Neanderthals. This all suggests that assimilation was a big part of Neanderthals' disappearance. With the arrival of anatomically modern humans, Cro-Magnons, began the late, Upper Paleolithic, which lasted from 40,000 to 11,500 years ago. Like the previous and future historical and archaeological periods, these ranges can vary across the continent and the world, due to varying cultural and technological progress. Upper Paleolithic in the heart of Europe starts with the Aurignacian, which is characterized by the increased use of bone, antler, and ivory, especially as projectile points. Aurignacian hunters were careful at handling their weapons, maintaining, polishing and repairing points whenever possible. This was also a time of growing artistic achievements like cave paintings, figurines, and bone wind instruments. Tool production also developed, with the more economical blade knapping that produced more usable stone blades from a single core. Following Aurignacian was the Gravettian, which brought decline in bone point use, but brought new shapes of stone implements, with a tendency toward smaller size. This was a time of great migrations and exchange of ideas, all the way from the steppes of Eastern Europe to the Atlantic coast. Raw materials for producing tools were brought across large distances, hundreds of kilometers from their original deposit. Art continued to flourish in this period, as did other cultural aspects. Bodies of the deceased were often strewn with red ochre that was crushed into powder. Earliest ceramic artifacts have been found from this period. The peak of the last glacial period in the Ice Age hindered contacts between many areas. Such was the case with the Solutrean culture of Western Europe, which developed at the same time as Epigravettian or Late Gravettian. Contacts between the two were re-established with the melting of ice, resulting in the Magdalenian culture developing across Western and part of the Central Europe. Some areas avoided this, however, as Epigravettian continued along with the Magdalenian culture. Throughout the Upper Paleolithic, tools became increasingly smaller, culminating in microliths, small shards or bladelets used as arrowheads and barbs. Additionally, this era gives us the earliest evidence of domesticated dogs, about 15,000 years ago, which provided companionship, aid at hunting and alert them of danger. Both Magdalenian and Epigravettian mark the peak of the Paleolithic era in terms of cultural development and tool manufacture. According to the newest genetic research, the Magdalenian societies of Western Europe were largely replaced by the Epigravettian ones, about 14,000 years ago. With the end of the Ice Age of Pleistocene, around 11,500 years ago, came the post-glacial period of Holocene, the same geological period in which we live today. At approximately the same time, historians mark the end of the Paleolithic and the beginning of a new period, Mesolithic. In general, it could be said that people continued to live as they did in the preceding Paleolithic, while the environment around them changed. The climate warmed, sea level had risen, lakes and marshes began to form, and forests like the mixed oak forest began to spread. Like ice caps that covered large chunks of Earth's surface, large animals like mammoths, hairy rhinos, and cave bears also disappeared. This was the era of the last hunter-gatherers in the heart of Europe. While such lifestyle didn't allow for permanent settlements, exceptional cases already began appearing during this time. Elsewhere in Europe, seasonal settlements and temporary camps sprung up, often near bodies of water. The production of microliths of the previous era continued in the Mesolithic. These came in varying shapes, from triangles to lunates or crescent-shaped. Sophistication of tool production enabled master crafters of Mesolithic to create retouched hypermicroliths, which were smaller than a fingertip. Harpoons also continued to see use, as did bone projectile points and bow and arrows. People perfected the fishhook, nets and baskets for fishing, and created dugout canoes for transport. While toolmaking continued to evolve, Mesolithic art forms didn't reach the high levels of the Paleolithic, though the use of red and yellow ochre continued, as did the creation of jewelry and ornaments from seashells, snail shells, bone and stone beads. These objects could end up hundreds of kilometers away from their place of origin, through trade between multiple nomad parties. Not all exchanges were peaceful though. Warfare was widespread during the Mesolithic, as is indicated by numerous bludgeoning injuries and arrow wounds of discovered bodies. Mesolithic came to an end with the establishment of first permanent settlements, agriculture, and animal husbandry, which gradually spread from the Near East. Just as these elements didn't appear all at once, Mesolithic didn't end everywhere at the same time. Mesolithic stonework methods, like trapezoid microliths, continued into the Neolithic. But while the Mesolithic hunters used closest sites of flint, even if it was inferior in quality, Neolithic trade enabled imports of higher quality chert and other materials from far beyond. What we call now the Neolithic Revolution was a drastic change of the prehistoric lifestyle. People gradually abandoned their hunter-gatherer way of life and started building permanent settlements. Instead of traveling to different areas in search for food, they started cultivating it right at their doorsteps. People went from passively benefiting from nature to actively transforming it. At first, it concentrated in the areas with mild winters, like the Mediterranean, through which the new lifestyle spread relatively quickly. The other route of expansion was centered around the fertile plains with loess soil, like the Balkans, and from there it continued to spread inland along major rivers, Danube, Rhone, Rhine. Waterways were the most important, if not the sole lines of communication with the wider world. Tents and makeshift wooden shelters of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were now replaced by rectangular, sturdy buildings. Settlements could be protected by wooden palisades or stone ramparts and were often strategically placed along rivers or on hilltops. These hillforts would begin a trend that would continue throughout prehistory in the heart of Europe, until the arrival of Romans. It is, however, the river bends that would be populated the most and over a longer period of time, due to good economic and strategic conditions. Around the Alps, the first pile-dwelling sites also sprung up. The new changes brought increased population, settlements, and cemeteries. The cemeteries show us that the Neolithic people were smaller than their predecessors, and that not all changes were positive. People more often suffered tooth decay, a consequence of transitioning from a protein diet to one rich in carbohydrates. Field fertilizing increased intestine problems and parasite infections. The more densely populated villages also meant that sickness could spread faster. The new lifestyle, while increasing safety in numbers and in walled settlements, also brought increased and more intense workload on the people. At the start of the Neolithic, people would usually be buried inside their dwellings. In later cemeteries, several hundred people could be buried, most often placed on their side, in fetal position. A major part of them were children, sometimes even beyond one half of burials. The high fatality rate of children would remain a constant factor across most of history. People would be buried with jewelry, weapons, and pottery, containing meats and cooked plant-based foods for the afterlife. Fire hearths were found beside the cemeteries, which contained ceramic shards, burnt animal bones, and cereals. These could either be the leftovers of a funerary feast, or later visits and offerings in memory of the dead. Cremation was very rare, but not non-existent. Despite food cultivation, hunting wild game continued to be an important source of sustenance. Besides food production, other technologies were also on the rise, such as pottery, through which we can separate Europe between three major culture groups: linear pottery, southeastern, and impressed wares. While these themselves had subgroups of regional variations, they possessed considerable relation of material culture, beyond just that of pottery. Advanced stonework brought in polished stone axes typical for this period. Additionally, the first protosickles, flint blades inserted into a wooden base, were developed in order to reap the grown crops. Obsidian was also a prized resource, especially in the central Mediterranean, where we can identify different exchange networks based on the unique chemical composition of material from different sources of volcanic glass. Besides the technological innovations and development, It is also theorized that the first Indo-European languages were also brought into the continent with this spread. This theory, however, is still not confirmed and, for now, it is more probable that first such languages were brought into the continent during the following Copper Age by people of the Yamnaya culture. Neolithic ended with the arrival of Metal Ages, with the Copper Age being the first one among them. Just like with the Neolithic, this transition wasn't sudden. Even more interestingly, at the transition period, in the millennium between 4800 and 3800 BC, Europe was split between the Western, Neolithic civilization, which was characterized by green jadeite axes, and the Eastern Copper Age civilization, with first products of gold and copper. These zones weren't singular civilizations per se, but more probably had two separate distribution systems. Between them, hillforts and protected settlements sprung up along the border regions, which often saw skirmishes and conflict between the two civilizations. The Age of Metal would usher in a new age of prosperity, with improved art and cultural aspects. New tools will enable the creation of new monuments and lifestyles. However, it would also bring new ways to wage war, conquer new lands, and subjugate other peoples.